watching Rogers TV.
Hi, and welcome to Freedom Fighters Code Gray. This is a show where we discuss human trafficking, an issue that's happening here in our own backyard in Ontario and across Canada. Now, some of the content in today's show may be triggering for viewers as we will be discussing subject matter related to trafficking and exploitation. So if you're looking for information and support related to human trafficking, you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline 24/7 at 1-833-900-1010. Again, that's 1-833-900-1010. What does trafficking look like in our community, and specifically, how is it impacting youth? Well, in today's episode, I am really grateful to be joined by Caitlin Ranasinghe, the program manager at BridgeNorth, who is going to be discussing the issue of human trafficking as it directly relates to youth. So welcome, Caitlin. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here today.
Hi, Michaela. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you work for an organization called BridgeNorth. So I would love if you could just start this episode off by talking a bit about what is BridgeNorth, who are you, what do we do, who do you serve in the community, and how can people learn more about your work?
Amazing. Yeah. So at BridgeNorth, we are a survivor-led agency working toward ending exploitation in Canada. We work with folks who have experienced sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, and we do our work through three sort of pillars. We have public education, where we get out and we talk to the public. We talk to anybody who wants to know about human trafficking: schools, educators, service providers, law enforcement, community groups, faith groups, businesses, to understand better what trafficking is, what it looks like, and what we can do about it in our communities. We're doing advocacy at all levels of government. So we're advocating for laws and policies that support and protect victims and survivors of human trafficking in Canada. And then we're doing direct services with those who are directly impacted by trafficking and exploitation. Right now, we primarily work with youth between the ages of 12 and 17. We have two programs for youth in New York Region and South Simcoe. We have the SAVVY program, which is a prevention education program that empowers youth with the knowledge and skills they need to keep themselves safe from sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. And we have the Life Edge program, which is a day program and one-on-one support program for youth who've experienced some kind of sex trafficking or sexual exploitation in their lives. Folks who want to learn more about us can find us on our website at bridgenorth.org. And there's lots of different ways that you can get in touch with us: by phone, by email, through our website. We're always happy to hear from people.
Oh my goodness, that is a lot of work that your team is doing. Very different angles that you're covering, from public education to advocacy to direct service, and really walking alongside those who have actually experienced trafficking or maybe targeted for exploitation. And what I think is really unique about what you shared is that you are actually working directly with youth as it relates to this issue. So we're talking about human trafficking today, and I know that people have different misconceptions and beliefs about what human trafficking is. So could you take some time to explain to our viewers what exactly human trafficking is?
Yeah, absolutely. Human trafficking, by definition, is the recruiting, moving, or holding a person for the purposes of exploiting them for profit. And really what traffickers do in Canada is they control and pressure people by force, threats, abuse, guilt, and even just manipulation for the purposes of making them do something for a profit. Usually in Canada, what that looks like is sex trafficking. That is human trafficking, where you're forcing someone to sell or trade sex for the profit of the trafficker. We also have this other concept called sexual exploitation. In human trafficking, there's a trafficker who's using some kind of force or control or coercion to make someone trade sex. They're sexually exploiting that person for their own profit. We also have this idea of sexual exploitation, where someone is abusing a position of power or vulnerability in order to obtain some kind of sexual services. So in Canada, anytime somebody buys or trades sex with someone under the age of 18, they're actually committing a crime against that person under 18. It's called sexual exploitation. Legally, kids under 18 can't consent to sell or trade sex for anything, not even just money, but shelter, drugs, food, gifts. If there's an adult who's offering those things in exchange for sex, sexual favors, or even sexual images, that's called sexual exploitation. And we see a lot of that as well.
Those are really helpful definitions and explanations. And just even the way that you differentiated those two terms of human trafficking for the purposes of sex, for example, sex trafficking, and then sexual exploitation, and how that might look within youth communities. And I think it's important for the public to know that that is a crime, right? Because I remember reading something recently where it was, I think, drivers instructors offering free lessons if people traded sex services, and to know if that is offered to someone under the age of 18, that is considered a crime, for example. And so what do you think human trafficking looks like in our communities? How does this actually play out?
Yeah, absolutely. It looks different for everyone. And because we know that sex trafficking is the most common form of trafficking in Canada, I'm really going to focus there. But I also want to acknowledge that there's other types of trafficking that happen. And we know that there's labor trafficking happening here, people being forced to provide labor services against their will and they're not being paid. And while I'm not focusing on that, I just want to acknowledge that too. But what we're seeing for young people in Canada is most of the time they're being impacted by sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. In our communities, this can look so many different ways. It might look like someone meeting an older guy who pretends to be their boyfriend and convinces them to run away from home, takes them from hotel to hotel or Airbnb to Airbnb to have sex with other men for money. But the trafficker, who's pretending to be the boyfriend, keeps all the money. It also, though, doesn't always look quite that cut and dry. A lot of times people know their trafficker before they're trafficked. They could be a friend, a romantic partner, a family member. It might be someone who's being convinced to sell sexual content online, maybe on OnlyFans or through a different type of social media, on a video chatting website. They might be live streaming. And there could be someone in the background pulling the strings, getting that person to sell and make that sexual content. It could be someone who is actually trading sex with individuals for money and then sending that money to someone they've never even met, who is their trafficker, who's kept themselves completely anonymous because they're all online. And then we have this sexual exploitation where there's not someone else who's necessarily pulling the strings, or not someone that we can identify who's pulling the strings. So that could look like a young person who has run away from home, who's facing living on the street. Somebody offers them a safe place to stay, and when they get there, that person tells them, well, to stay here, you're going to have to pay me somehow. And you can do that through sex or selling images or giving me sexual favors. It can look like young people being put in a position where they feel they have to trade sex to receive substances or food or protection on the street or for gifts or meals or a trip. It can be really anything, and it can look so different. And what's really tricky is on the outside, a lot of the times it might look like that young person is making bad choices. And I really want to emphasize that that is not true. When someone is being trafficked, there's someone else who's pulling the strings. Usually traffickers are incredible manipulators. Usually the young person might feel like they're actually making lots of those choices, but the trafficker has a really unique ability to control them through manipulation. It may not even involve violence, though a lot of times it does. And when a young person is being exploited, it's often because they're put in a position where they don't feel they have another choice, where they don't have somewhere safe to stay. So what are they going to do? Sleep on the street where they don't feel safe? Or trade sex with someone where at least they know there's a roof over their head and they're not going to get jumped in the middle of the night. And so we have to be really, I think, understanding of what's going on behind the scenes when it might look like someone's making choices that they actually don't have a lot of control over.
It's really helpful to hear specifically the ways in which choice may be coerced or manipulated. And what I hear you saying is we really need to challenge some of our assumptions and judgments that we make about what young people are doing in the community, to know that there's a big picture going on. There's an example that you gave that made me wonder, and I'm thinking maybe our viewers would be wondering this too. You said, okay, so exploitation could look like someone selling sexual content online and then sending that money to someone who they've never met before, who's anonymous. And so I'm wondering if you can shed light on specifically how maybe that relationship would have developed and formed, and why that person might feel like they have an obligation to send this person money that they don't in fact know.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. A lot of the times what traffickers do is they build a relationship with a young person. They make them feel like they understand them, like they can trust them. And that might be by pretending to be a romantic partner, a friend. It may actually be someone they've always known. It could even be a family member. One of the most common things that traffickers will do is reach out to young people online, start up a conversation, make them feel really special, and start a romantic relationship with them. They will usually try to identify something in that young person's life that they can use to manipulate them. Maybe that young person doesn't feel understood. Maybe they're being bullied at school. Maybe they don't feel safe in their home. Maybe they've experienced abuse in the past. It could be really anything. And they use that thing to really build a relationship. I understand you. You can trust me. I love you. I think you're smart and beautiful and funny and clever. Whatever that young person needs, I'll protect you. And by building that relationship, the young person often feels really connected to them. They feel like they can trust them. So when they introduce this idea of selling sex, maybe it's to pay off a debt or someone that they owe that they're afraid of. Maybe it's to help them get to this life that they've always wanted. We'll make all this money and then we can have the life we've always wanted. That's one way that it can happen. Sometimes it's offered to a young person as, I know a great way that you can make money. I'll manage it for you. You'll keep most of the money. I'll book the hotels. I'll arrange the customers. And you'll just pay me a small fee, but you're in control, you're making all the money. And in reality, they're giving almost all of their money to the trafficker and they don't have really any control over who they're sleeping with or where they're going. Sometimes they may also use threats. They might get the young person to send an intimate image to them and then use that as blackmail and say, if you don't do this, I'm going to send these pictures to your parents, to your friends, to everybody at your school. So there's lots of different ways that traffickers can do that and convince a young person to do something that they never would have considered on their own. But that young person's in a place where they don't feel they have really any other choice and they don't know who to reach out to, or they really think they have a lot of control over the situation.
That last example you gave reminds me of the concept of sextortion, which we're just seeing a huge increase in Canada specifically, not only for girls, but for boys as well, and how it's the significant pressure that's being placed on young people by predators to have their images shared non-consensually to people as a form of blackmail, really, to force youth and folks into really vulnerable situations. And so what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that young people specifically tend to have about trafficking?
We hear a lot of misconceptions about trafficking. One of the most common things we hear from young people is that online, they're getting this messaging that they can make a ton of money really safely by selling sexual images or videos. OnlyFans has really skyrocketed lately in terms of popularity among young people because we feel like it's anonymous, we feel like it's safe, we feel like we have control, and that's really just not true. We also hear this idea that it would never happen to me. I have control over what's going on. I would never be trafficked. I would never be hurt that way. And unfortunately, because people are really good manipulators, we don't know that. And all it takes is one really scary, really unsafe person to put you in a really unsafe, scary position. We also, hear this idea that trafficking only happens by people being snatched off the street. You're grabbed in a white van downtown Toronto. You're kidnapped from the mall. You're going to be drugged in a movie theater. And that's not how it's happening. It's really happening online. Most of the time it's through manipulation and relationship building. So you feel like the person who's introducing this idea to you is a safe person that you can trust and who's going to take care of you. And you have no idea what the actual intention is behind that person's, what their motivations are.
Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and just insights on the realities of youth exploitation in our communities. We're going to take a short break and then continue this conversation.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, we encourage Canadians to pause and remember all that veterans have sacrificed for us, lest we forget.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Hi, and welcome back to Freedom Fighters Code Gray. In this show, we are discussing human trafficking and specifically how it is impacting communities of youth. I'm joined by Caitlin from BridgeNorth, who is shedding light on this topic and sharing her expertise on this issue. So Caitlin, I'm wondering, as we pick up the segment of the show, if you could talk about our law specifically, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding of how our laws work. And so what does our law say about sex trafficking and youth?
Absolutely. And I'll keep it relatively brief, given that I'm not a lawyer. But sex trafficking is illegal in Canada. I think most people would assume that. It's illegal to bring someone into Canada for the purposes of sex trafficking, but it's also illegal to traffic people here in Canada. So that means it's illegal to force, trick, convince anybody to sell sex for your own profit. And what's different for youth is it's also illegal for someone to trade anything with a young person for sex. There's lots of laws around sex work, but specifically with youth, that's called sexual exploitation. It is illegal to organize for someone else to sell sex. So even if it doesn't feel like somebody was forcing or convincing or coercing, it's also illegal for someone to pay for a hotel room and arrange for a customer to come and buy sex from someone, whether they're an adult or a child. If someone claims to be helping a young person to sell sex, that's actually illegal. That's human trafficking or sexual exploitation, or it falls under a number of different crimes. Something that I think is also really important for folks to know is that if you are in a position where someone has convinced you to trade or sell sex, or you've been put in a position where you feel like that is your best option right now, you are not the one committing the crime. Traffickers will often tell people that it's their fault. If they reach out for help, they're going to get in trouble, that you are the one who's the problem. And that is not true. If you are in a position where you are worried about your safety, if you want support, if you feel like you might be being trafficked, you can reach out for help. You will be believed. You will not be arrested for being put in that situation, and you'll actually be offered help. So I just want people to really know that it is not your fault. You are not the one breaking the law if that's the situation that you've been put in.
Thank you, Caitlin, for helping to articulate that and for relaying to youth that it's not their fault, because I think that's one of the lies that traffickers and exploiters use to hold people in situations and make them feel like that there's no way out.
Absolutely.
And so I was wondering also about, you mentioned, okay, it's illegal for people to be brought in from Canada to be trafficked, but it's also illegal for people to exploit others for profit here in Canada itself. So where exactly is the sex trafficking of youth taking place?
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of us have this idea that it's happening elsewhere, it's happening in other countries in the world, or even if we know it's happening here in Canada, because it is happening here in Canada, we might think, oh, that's only happening in a certain community. That's still not, that wouldn't happen in my community, that wouldn't happen at my kid's school, that wouldn't happen at my school. There's no way. What we know, though, is trafficking is happening absolutely everywhere. Exploitation is happening absolutely everywhere. We know that it's happening in our communities here in York Region and Simcoe County. We know that trafficking is happening in Barrie, in Newmarket, in Aurelia, in Aurora, in Georgina, in absolutely every town in our communities, in our regions. We know that it's happening to kids in our local high schools. We know that it's happening online, where kids are even still living at home and being trafficked or exploited online. We know that it's happening on the streets for kids who are experiencing homelessness. We know that it's happening at hotels and Airbnbs and sometimes even in people's vehicles. It's happening around us a lot more than one would really think.
What you just shared that is happening in our high schools and our school systems and all these different communities was even making me reflect on conversations I've had with teachers where peers, there's more and more pressure from peer to peer to be selling sexual services online, which is also a crime. And so it's important for youth to know that, right? And that it doesn't have to be an adult who's pressuring a youth, but the pressure can happen peer to peer as well. Yeah. So let's talk about social media, because you continue to bring up the fact that this is really happening online, so it can take place anywhere. What do folks need to know about social media and trafficking? How are these things linked? What's going on? And, what do we need to know to keep everyone safe?
Yeah, one of the things that we know about traffickers is they spend their time where teens spend their time. So 10, 15 years ago, that might have been at the mall, at the park, near the high school, at the local hangout spots. And now we're all spending most of our free time on social media, whether we're teens or adults. A lot of us are on social media most of the time. So that's where traffickers are now too. We know that it is a lot easier and safer for traffickers to find and target people online. The internet can be really anonymous. You can pretend to be anybody you want to be. You don't know who's behind the picture and who's behind the messages. And traffickers know this, so they're using that. They oftentimes will just scroll through social media, look for young people that they can message. They'll send follow requests, message requests. They'll start a connection online. And because all of us are online all the time and we're so familiar with it, we often feel really safe to message back and forth with someone that we don't know because they're not here in person. They can't hurt me. They have mutual friends. It says they go to a local high school, so it feels like you can trust them. And the problem with that, though, is it's not as safe as we think it is. Traffickers are pretending to be people who are younger than they are. They are using someone else's social media. Sometimes they're saying that they are who they are and pretending that they want to be in a relationship with you or that they have a great job opportunity. And the thing that's really tough about that is social media should be safe. We should be safe online. And unfortunately, there's really dangerous people. The way that I think about it is when I was little, my parents had rules for me when I would go to the park or to places that were really busy. If we're going to the mall, you hold my hand the whole time. You don't talk to strangers. You don't go with anybody if they offer you like candy or to come see puppies or anything like that. We had lots of rules to keep me safe. I should have just been safe to go to the park or to a theme park or to the grocery store as a kid, but we know that there's unsafe people out there. So there were rules for me to keep myself safe. And we haven't been having those same kinds of conversations online because social media came up so fast and it's so hard to keep up with. Parents of teens didn't grow up with social media, so they're not as familiar with how it works. They don't know that there are predators online. And so why would teens know that if they're not getting that information from parents or teachers or anywhere else because we're not talking about it as much? And so I like to think about it that way, that we need to have an awareness of what's unsafe about social media, even though we should just get to be safe online. There are bad people out there who are looking to exploit young people wherever they can, and they're taking advantage of how social media works for their own gain. One of the things that we see a lot of is Snapchat. We feel really safe on Snapchat to do things like send intimate images or have conversations that we might not normally have because the things delete after a short period of time. And what's tricky is that's not always the case. There's nothing stopping someone from screenshotting your picture, taking a picture using another device, sharing it with someone else. If I think about it, like what if I sent an intimate image to my boyfriend and I trust him and he actually is a genuinely good guy, but one day he's with his friends and he accidentally leaves his phone unlocked. One of his friends comes across my picture and secretly sends it to himself. Now I don't know where my picture is anymore. Anybody could have it. He could send it to other people. If he's a trafficker, he could use that against me to convince me to do things that I don't want to do. And so we really just don't know what happens to our information after we've sent it. We have no control once it's in somebody else's hands. And traffickers know that too. So they try to get us to do things like send images to them so that they can use that against us later down the line.
Caitlin, you have outlined just really the complexity of social media and what it looks like to be safe online. And I think as you talked about how fast technology has advanced, people are still just trying to orient themselves around even healthy habits of how to use these devices as an individual, let alone the openness and the networks it creates to people all over the world, including folks who have nefarious intent when they're building those relationships. And I think what you've highlighted that I hear is really important is we need to learn to have these conversations with youth and how to have them in an ongoing way to ensure, just like those boundaries that you were explaining were set for you when you were a young person to keep yourself safe. How do we then equip other youth in the online digital world to see and maybe a red flag perhaps, and where to seek support if something is happening? So what do you think is really important for teens to know if this is something that's happened to them? Maybe someone did take a picture on their partner's device of an intimate image, or maybe they were pressured to send an image and then now they are being forced to do something, or maybe they're being exploited and pressured and sex trafficking because of it another way. So what do you want folks to know if this is happening to them?
The most important thing I'd want them to know is it is not your fault. Traffickers, exploiters, and abusers do a really good job of making people think that it's their fault, that it's your fault, that you've made bad choices, that no one will believe you, that no one will help you. And I want you to know that those are lies. It is not your fault. There is help. There are people out there who will believe you and who will offer you support. There's a few resources that I want to highlight for young people if they've been put in a position, maybe they've sent an intimate image, maybe they're in a position where they're being exploited. I want you to be able to reach out for help because it's not your fault. Kids Help Phone is a great crisis line that you can reach out to. Needhelpnow.ca is a great resource for young people who have had their intimate images shared without their consent. There's a lot of great help that they can offer you. You can obviously reach out to us at BridgeNorth if you'd like support. And like Michaela mentioned at the beginning of this show, there's the Human Trafficking Hotline, which is a great resource for folks. They have a list of all the resources in Canada that are related to human trafficking and exploitation, and they're an excellent help.
Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. And although it's a difficult and uncomfortable thing to talk about, it's so essential that this information gets out in the community so folks are aware of what's happening to prevent it from happening, but also to disrupt cycles of exploitation and to support those who are currently in a situation where they are experiencing sex trafficking. So thank you for the work that you're doing at BridgeNorth, to you and your team, and for the ways that you're walking alongside youth to see an end to sexual exploitation and sex trafficking in Canada. If you're tuning into today's episode and you are looking for information and support related to human trafficking, like Caitlin just shared, there's the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline that you can call 24/7 at 1-833-900-1010. Again, that's 1-833-900-1010. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's episode. Please feel free to share it on your social media networks or with a friend if you think this is content that other folks in the community should listen to and hear. So we hope to catch you next time on Freedom Fighters Code Gray.
Connect with us by visiting our website or email us at comments@rogerstv.com.
It's closing time, and you stayed out longer than you planned. So now you can't drive, and the buses have stopped running. You could always call your girlfriend. Or maybe your roommate? What about